Michael Muckin. Someone was supposed to officially introduce me, but I think I jump-started him. So I apologize if you're out there. The one question that everyone's probably asking is where are the slides, or where's the presentations in your handouts? Due to last-minute cancellation, I'm filling in with about 6 days' notice, so my slides never made the manual. They will be available on the website, and hopefully by tomorrow they could even be printed out for you. I don't know. I'll make sure I leave my email address. If anybody wants them, I'll send them to you. Can everyone hear me? Anyone not? Okay. Like I said, my name is Michael Muckin. I'm a security architect. I work for MCS, which is Microsoft Consulting Services. Very different beast than Microsoft Corporate. It's almost like a different entity altogether. We're the guys that are out there day in, day out, actually working at the customer locations, doing a number of different things. I specifically, as a security specialist, do both sides. I do the design of network security, and I also do assessments, attacks, penetration tests, etc. I'm going to talk to you today about IIS 6 security architecture, and I called it It's a Whole New World for a number of reasons. Number one, IIS 6 is basically the culmination of the security push that you probably heard so much about, right? You heard Scott Culp talk about it this morning. It's all over everything. Microsoft security press always talks about trustworthy computing and security push. I'm going to tell you what that actually means in this product. And a whole new world as well, not just from IIS 6 itself, but we're getting into that next phase of the web, right? Where you're going to see a lot more mission critical and intercommunicated systems through web services, SOAP, etc. So I'm going to try and talk about that a little bit. I will be talking about ASP.NET. I have about an hour and 15 minutes to try and cover a lot of material, so I'll get there as best I can. If anyone has questions throughout, don't hesitate to ask. If we start going too far down, I'll hold off and we'll hold the questions till the end because I want to make sure we get through everything. Okay, so the agenda, real quick, we're just going to set the stage, what we're talking about. We're going to talk about the security design of IIS 6, what makes it different from IIS 5 and everything before it. We'll talk about ASP.NET, and we'll look at some scanning and some tools that are available for you. Some scanning tools you may be aware of. We'll launch them against IIS 6 just to see what comes back. And then we'll look at locking down an IIS 6 box, which is going to be significantly easier because a lot of the work is already done for you. You've heard about the secure default. Well, we'll take a look at that and you'll see. And the demos throughout is actually not 100% true. We're going to do most of the demos at the end. Okay? So, no news out there. First of all, how many people have actually had the chance to touch IIS 6? Okay, not that many. All right. We already know IIS is a primary target for a number of attacks. And that's not going to change. Just because IIS 6 is coming out, people are still going to go after it. They're going to go after anything that's out there. I already talked about security push and trustworthy computing. IIS 6 should be the first real tangible evidence of what those initiatives are going to give to you. Because up until now, there hasn't been a whole lot of real tangible evidence in that space, has there been? Yeah, we've got some tools for doing patches, we got other things, but this should be an actual product that you could say, hey, this isn't a bad job. From what I've seen of it, from what I've touched it, and had other customers that I've worked with touch it, I think we've done a pretty good job. So, as far as trends, can everybody see these slides okay? All right. As far as trends in the vulnerability space, I always look at things from a vertical perspective and a horizontal perspective. The vertical, you got your physical security, which we really can't talk much about. That's just physical security is physical security. Then you got your network and your OS and your application layer. And then at the horizontal, you got your browser, your web server, your logic and or web services, and your data on the back end. And I think it's safe to say that vulnerabilities in that area are pretty much leveling out. Okay, we've pretty much figured out how to lock down the network. We've pretty much figured out how to lock down the OS. Okay, I'm not saying there's not going to be more vulnerabilities in that area, okay, but it's not that steep curve that it's been. And I think we can also agree that if we look at those areas, the application layer itself, and then either through the browser or the web server, punching backwards and getting a hold of data or the actual logic that you're attacking, those types of vulnerabilities are on the rise. Okay, and I certainly agree, or believe, I should say, that IIS 6 in the web server space is going to continue that leveling out in that particular area. It's going to become more and more where a majority of the vulnerabilities come from the application itself. Okay. Okay, so what did they do with this design? The whole goal was fewer vulnerabilities out of the box. And we'll talk about how we got there. The reduced attack surface, the defensive depth, and staying up to date, which is the patching. IIS 6 will have some, depending on the type of patch it is, if it's a specific patch to IIS 6, we'll have the ability to patch it on the fly. All right? In other words, you don't have to reboot it. You don't have to kill your box to install a patch. All right, I know I'm really happy to hear that one myself. As far as the product quality, what they did to get there, the security stand down, what that really meant, okay, was everyone stopped writing code for new features and just went back and took a look at every piece of code they had that went into IIS and scrubbed it from top to bottom. And it wasn't just us. There were a number of third parties out there that came in and did code reviews for us. Okay, a lot of buffer overruns are found. Okay, I wish we could, or I wish they would publicly say all the things they found as a result of the push. A few things did come out as bulletins, but nowhere near as many as were actually found. The /GS, when they compile, that's not a guarantee, but it's just an added feature when you're compiling your code to look for your buffer overruns. Internally, we had two tools called prefix and prefast that every piece of code has to go through. That is another buffer overrun scanner. That's all it does. The QFE and the IIS core teams merged, which, the part of the siloing inside of Microsoft, we're trying to knock down those silos and make people work a little more jointly. That's going to be a huge one. Removed a lot of legacy code, which we'll be talking about. So, when you say reduce the attack surface, what am I talking about? When you install an IIS 5 box, that's what you get. Okay, clean and install with Windows 2000. Just pop the CD in and run with it. What do you get? You get all of that stuff enabled. ASP, ISAPI, CGI, front page, just way too much stuff is turned on by default. So when we say reducing the attack surface, it's important to understand it's not just the attack surface of that box, but by extension, how many people just take that CD and slap it in there? Okay, so you're reducing the attack surface of your box and the community at large, right? Because if everyone taking that CD and popping it in there is turning those features on, then the attack surface of the network at large is just that much greater. Okay? When you install Windows 2003, what used to be .NET Server, and so if I say .NET Server, it's a hard habit to break, but it is Windows Server 2003 now. All those features are disabled. The only thing, in fact, if you just install Windows 2003 Server, you don't even get IIS. It is not turned on by default. Okay? When you choose to install IIS on Windows 2003, the only thing that's turned on by default is it's a static web server. In other words, they'll shell back HTML, text files, and things like that. They won't do any type of dynamic content whatsoever. You have to specifically tell it what you want, which I think is a great thing. I mean, that's going to give your network a whole other degree of protection, just that right there. It'll also force administrators and developers to work in what they're given, right? I mean, if you have a wide open box to start with, it's just like, well, it worked here. I got to try to put it in production, and now it doesn't work anymore. Well, in production, a lot of times you lock things down and you break them. If you start in that environment and you have to work in that environment, then you're going to be safe throughout. To take a look at this, how this could potentially affect the vulnerability matrix. What is this table telling us? The large red dots represent major vulnerabilities in the IIS 5 space. Okay, the yellow ones are moderate, and the white ones are less critical vulnerabilities. But as you can see here, all of the major vulnerabilities, the large red dots, occurred in either legacy code or things that probably didn't need to be turned on by default in the first place. Okay? The IDQ, the web hits stuff, the internet printing ISAPI. I mean, who in here has ever used internet printing? Has anyone? No? Okay, so I'm not the only one who hasn't. The ISM, the password change functionality. I mean, not a good idea in the first place, right? But has anyone ever used that? I know I haven't. So I mean, it doesn't need to be there. The last presentation that was just in here, front page, a lot of times that gets turned on by default, and we saw the damage that can happen with that by it just being there. Okay, so get rid of it out of the box. ASP had one major one, the ASP overflow, the chunked encoding, and the IIS core had two major ones as well. So what else did we do? What other steps were taken in that? The buffer overflows. Are we saying there's never going to be another buffer overflow in the product? Absolutely not. Okay, there's code that's been out there for 20 years. They're still finding buffer overflows in BSD type code. So the buffer overflow is not going away. We hope we can kill it. We're doing our best, but we don't think it's going to happen. But the idea is reduce the damage done if it happens. When you install IIS 6, you have two new accounts that you have at your disposal, and the default account is called the network service account. All of the code for IIS 6 runs under the network service account by default, which has very, very, very minimal privileges. Just as a comparison here, you also have something called the local service, which if that box is not going to talk to any other box for any other reason, then that's fine. If that box needs to go talk to another server for logic, or talk to a database, or anything like that, you never get to give it the network service so it can have network communication. Okay? It's basically, that means when it talks to the other box, it's going to authenticate as the machine. Okay? But the default privileges, the NT privileges that we're talking about with those accounts are just those 6. There's about 25 or so, can't remember the exact number, privileges that you can have assigned to a principal. Okay? The network service only gets those 6 right there. I think it might actually bumped up to 7 before we go to RTM. Everything I'm talking about, by the way, is subject to change because we haven't actually published the shipping code yet. But as you can see here, nothing there is extremely dangerous. Okay? There's no debug, there's no overwriting memory, there's no act as part of the operating system, there's none of that. Okay, versus the local system context, which has 21 full NT privileges and is basically God on the box. Okay, well, what happened with IIS 5? All your ISAPI stuff ran in the INET info process, and the INET info process ran with what security context? Local system, right? So if you buffer overflowed something of an ISAPI that was running in the INET info process, you're sitting on the box as God. All right? These processes will be sitting in a network service context by default. You can change it if you want, okay? But you have to do it. All right? You can change it and make it the local system account. But then you're putting yourself right in the same spot you were with IIS 5. Okay? So if you buffer overrun something in IIS 6, you're going to be sitting there with very few privileges. You're not going to be able to do much. Okay? We hope that doesn't happen, but if it does, we're hoping you're going to be protected. And the note at the bottom, don't run anything as local system unless you absolutely have to. It's just not a good thing. Yes?
Can you programmatically enable a lot of those features?
The question is, can you programmatically enable a lot of those features? And which features were they? The list that I had up there before? Yeah, yes. The answer is yes, you can programmatically enable them, either from a number of different ways. You can do it with the metabase. That's probably the best way of doing it, hitting the metabase. Any other questions on that last slide? Okay, the canonicalization, which I actually said it right the first time, so I'm not going to say it anymore. First of all, what is that word, canonicalization? It means, in its simplest format. And this one hurt us real bad on a lot of places, right? The Unicode directory traversal, the double decode directory traversal, they are results of canonicalization issues. In other words, through different types of encoding of different character sets, what you think you are saying is one thing, but it actually means something else. And we'll get a little more detail on that in just a second. The default handler is restricted to a list of known extensions, which I will show you. So when you say, I'm going to turn this feature on, I'm going to turn ASP on, okay, but I'm only going to enable or associate a few extensions with that. And in addition, as you'll see, you can also say, I'm only going to enable a few verbs to go along with that. Denial of service, there's built-in recycling. You can set all kinds of limits. We'll get to that in a minute. Cross-site scripting issues. Again, it's not a guarantee, but with ASP.NET, you have server-side validation on a lot of things. There's a whole list of ASP.NET server-side functions that you can use to validate data coming into you. Yes, you should be doing data validation on the client side as well, but client side is easily bypassed, right? I mean, I could spoof data going to a server coming from a client in a number of different ways. So you want to validate your data on the client, and you also want to validate data on the server. By the way, if you want real good details on that kind of stuff, how to actually go through all the ins and outs of validating data on both sides, I'm going to show you an example, but if you really want to drill down into it, make sure you see Mike Howard and Dave LeBlanc's talk. They go into that in great detail. Executing command line scripts. If you looked at a Windows 2000 box, not even an IIS 5 box, just looked at a Windows 2000 box, right? And the default permissions on all your exes in System 32 are everyone full control. Oops, okay? Not a good idea. So when I have IIS 6, the accounts that are associated with IIS and ASP.NET for that matter can't execute those exes. Okay? I still recommend always checking out your environment. Are those ACLs good enough for you? And if you need to lock it down tighter, go right ahead. But by default, your iUser accounts and your IWAM accounts cannot get to those files. And by default, no write access for your anonymous accounts in your home directory. Sounds simple, right? But it's there. So what do we get rid of? The virtual directories for your scripts and your MSADC. Scripts probably hurt us as bad as anything out there. Okay? The site names / scripts and your funky URLs with %C0 and %255C. And the next thing you know, you got a command shelled back to you, right? We all seen those somewhere in the Hacking Exposed and things like that. Well, take away those executable directories and you can't do anything. Secure timeout and limits. If anyone's ever hardened an IIS 5 box, 16K request limit, where you go into the parameters of the W3 service and set max client receive buffer to 16384, that's there automatically now. You don't have to go out of your way and do that in the registry. Okay? You can tweak it if you want, but that's the default size there to make sure you don't get DOS'd or an attempted DOS. Legacy code, I already talked about the ISN. That's the password change, DLL. That's gone. Okay, you shouldn't be changing your password over the internet anyhow. The sub-authentication module is gone. The IIS sub a.dll, that is no longer there. And check if file exists. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. But all that stuff has been taken out. Okay? So a lot of that attack surface that existed for IIS 5 is now gone. Ackling. Log files are locked down. I already told you about all your exes are locked down. This is a very recent one, by the way. The IE Windows 2003 server will come shipped with IE locked down very tightly. Okay, the zones in your IE configuration are going to be locked down, so you really can't get it anywhere except, the local computer and not much else. So, why do you think that's there? Well, you shouldn't be browsing from your servers anyhow. Okay, but to further lock down the box, another layer of defense that's in there. If you want to browse some stuff from your server, you're going to have to turn on what you're going to browse to. Yes, sir. The question is, will IE be on the server? The answer is yes, it will be. Mm-hmm.
I agree. Eventually, it should be not installed at all.
That's a good point. That is a good point. I know in XP you can remove it if so desired. I don't think it's going to be there for server, but maybe it will be in the future. ASP. This one could cause some issues in your development process. ASP enable parent paths is turned off. So if in your code, if you have .. anywhere, then you're going to have some problems. Okay, but .. can cause other problems besides just you having to maybe redo some code or redevelop your rethink your development procedures. Hang detection. We'll take a look at this in a bit. If your ASP applications are hanging in IIS 5, you basically had to wait for it to time out to see if it will come back. Okay, but in the meantime, your website isn't doing much else. Okay, there's a hang detection built in there now, so that if the ASP is in a hung state for a while and the timeout doesn't kick in, it can send a signal and reset itself. A default 4 meg response buffer limit for denial of service and buffer overrun protection, and the health detection, which is very similar to the hang detection, which we'll get to in just a second. The actual details on the canonicalization, basically it comes down to a raw byte must be in the form of URL token per the RFCs. Okay, nothing else will be accepted. In particular, I'm not going to read all that to you. You guys can read that just as well as I can. The real important one is that last bullet item down there, but not 0x00-0x1f, etc. That's the UTF encoding character sets, which caused all the problems with the directory traversal stuff. Okay? Does anybody know exactly how that happened? The UTF stuff? No? Does anyone want to know? Okay. Take the Unicode traversal, the %C0, %AF. Now, if you take the C0 and the AF in binary, that means one thing. Okay, just a regular byte. Let's see, I'm kind of rusty here. C0, that would be 1100, right? 0000, and the AF would be 10101111. Now you take that in a UTF format, and the UTF imposes certain bits at the front end of that. So What really happened is what was supposed to be the one character set turned into a 2F, okay, which if you look at the 2F character is a slash, okay? And that's where when you put in that particular series of characters in the URL, it considered it a slash, it escaped out, went to your System32 directory and executed stuff. Well, that's not there anymore, okay? You know, that has been taken care of in the way that the URLs are handled. Okay, there's a parser there that will parse all that stuff correctly. The NTFS canonicalization, there's really not any known exploits or known problems with the whack whack question mark whack, but that has been addressed as well as part of the reviewing of the code. All right, and streams are gone, so the colon $ data and other similar type issues you won't have to worry about any longer. All right, third-party code. And what do I mean by third-party code? Anything that is application-specific code. Okay, the web files, any ASP files, etc., your DLLs, they run out in the worker processes. Very powerful sandboxing. The isolation features in IIS 6 are far and above what we had with IIS 5. Okay? Yeah, we had the pooled and we had the isolated in IIS 5, right? But a lot of people chose to run their stuff in process anyhow for performance reasons. And you really kind of lost the benefit of having that. And in the medium, even if you put the stuff in medium, you're trying to get the best of both worlds. If you got the medium and that one component in the medium space crashed, it would take down everything else with it that was also in the medium space. So, someone have a question? Yes? Are these the ones that are what? Examples? Sandbox. Oh, so the question is, the actual W3 services, are they what's actually being sandboxed? Yes. Yes, they are. And I have a good graphic of that in just a second. Where does the third-party code apply? Good question, and I think we'll get there very shortly. And if I don't, bring it back, please. Okay? And HTTP pre-request logging, which is a big part of the whole rearchitecture. So here's where I think a lot will start coming together. Okay? In IIS 5, here's what it looked like. You had inetinfo.exe, which basically was everything. And it ran out there in the user space, the user process space. It had its ISAPI filters and extensions loaded. And you could also, through DLL host.exe, with medium or isolated, have other applications running out there. But everything still kind of had to come through inetinfo.exe. So, if you lost inetinfo.exe, what happened? You pretty much lost everything, right? Or if inetinfo was compromised, then you were compromised all the way through, because we already talked about the process or the context that process runs in, right? Also notice the interface from the TCP/IP stack to inetinfo. Everything went through WinSock. So that's another thing. When you're accepting web input, you have to process it at inetinfo, and then you have to process it through WinSock. So you got extra layers you're going through. Number one, performance, you have an issue. Number two, anytime, the more complexity you have when you're processing information, complexity is the enemy of security, right? So I might have parsed something correctly in inetinfo, but WinSock may not have parsed something correctly. And that was the case, often. So you had to recycle the box, or excuse me, recycle IIS to get everything back, which is basically IIS reset, right? And then while you're doing the IIS reset, every website or virtual directory that was in there was down during that period of time. So, what's it look like in IIS 6.0? Well, big change here, which we'll talk about in a little bit. As you notice, there's no more of the WinSock there. Okay, we have a new HTTP request handler that sits down in kernel mode, which we're going to talk about in just a second. The requests come into that. Up above in the user space, we have your application pools, which that's where the actual code is running, and the actual web service is serving that content out. And we have what's called the WAS, which monitors all of that off to the side. So there's your three components there: your request handler, your application pools, and your web application service over here. INetInfo is still there, but it's only there for FTP, SMTP, and the metabase sits there. Okay. So when a request comes in, it goes into the kernel mode queue, right? And queues up these requests. HTTP.sys, as we're going to call it here in just a second, will forward that request to the appropriate application pool based on how you configure it. And the response will come back through HTTP.sys. But if you lose an application pool, okay, you still have all your requests in the queue. All right? The www service administration and monitoring will pick up that application pool has crashed for whatever reason, recycle it, and let the response continue. Okay, so you don't lose your requests because they're being queued up in the HTTP kernel mode listener. Okay?
In that instance, what would happen to any session data associated with that process?
Say again? I'm sorry?
In that instance, if one of the applications crashed, what would happen to any associated session data?
The question is, what would happen to any associated session data? That's a very good question, and it depends on how you're doing session. If you're doing it cookie-based or storing it back in a database, you should be fine. If you're doing it session-based from the application-specific session, then you're probably going to lose that. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. What does that mean? Those services are still handled. The question is, FTP and SMTP, what are they doing in INetInfo, right? Is that the question? Okay. They are still over there because, let's face it, there's not a huge demand for redoing FTP or redoing SMTP from an IIS perspective. So it was decided that they were fine right there in the INetInfo process. So that they were always there before in IIS 5. They were there, and they are still there in IIS 6. Are they still going through WinSock? That's a good question. I don't know that. I don't know that. I would assume they are, but don't quote me on it. Can you say that again, please?
He asked how you would initiate an SMTP session from an HTTP request.
I'll repeat. The comment was, how do you start an SMTP session from an HTTP request? They're generally separate pieces of communication and wouldn't be there anyhow. So that would never come into that area. Your SMTP listener would be listening on a completely different service, right? And that would have to be serviced through that listener. Okay, so putting that prior slide into some diagrams here. It came up with a HTTP.sys kernel mode listener. Okay, the listener and the request router, which we just saw. It sits in the kernel mode. The web application service is your configuration and process manager. That's your tool, basically, to configure how http.sys handles its information and what applications are you going to put where. And then your W3 core, that's your actual web applications where they're actually going to run, where apps get loaded, including ASP stuff, including ISAPIs. Whoa. And you can have many W3 cores. You've probably heard the term web garden. If you haven't heard it, and if you start reading through IIS 6 literature, you'll see that. So, take the idea of a web farm and bring it down to a single box. Right? You can have multiple web servers running on a single box and actually have them be truly isolated. Okay. As a kernel mode component, http.sys will always be running, assuming the box is up. It will always be there. The reliability, it processes the routing based on the URL. And obviously, as a kernel mode, it's going to be extremely fast. The question is HTTP.sys a component of IIS or .NET? Let me define .NET. When I say .NET, I talk about the .NET framework, and that's only what I talk about. So in that context, HTTP.sys is not a component of the .NET framework. HTTP.sys is a part of IIS 6.
I think he's asking if you don't install IIS, will HTTP get on?
So the follow-on question is, if you don't install IIS 6, will HTTP.sys be there? No. Okay. Okay, and this just gives you a little more detail on how HTTP.sys will accept the requests. The namespace mapper is where it figures out where to send it by the URL. If it doesn't find a namespace mapped to it in that space, that's where you'll get a 404. Okay? And if it does find it, it'll send it to the, pop it in the proper request queue, get the response back, and send back the response. Obviously, what sits on top of it is the actual application pools and the administration service. All right, the application manager, the web admin service, manages the lifetime of the W3 cores. Like I said, it is basically your configuration manager for configuring http.sys. There's no application code here. Okay, that's what the application pools are for. This is just the configuration component only. And that is hosted in the service host.exe process. Okay, your W3 core, this is your main web processing DLL for processing the web requests that come from http.sys. Okay, so once they've come into that queue, the queue decides where to send it to, and it goes to one of these application pools through your W3 core. It loads any ISAPI filters and extensions that have to be configured. And remember, here's where the process that those things are running in is important, because here's where your application pools run. Okay? And your application pools, by default, are running in the network service context. Okay, so even though we're loading ISAPIs, which may possibly have some issues with them, okay, you're in a safe context by default. Okay, I don't know how well you can see that particular slide. I'm going to fire up the other box here shortly and show it to you. And what it's showing there is you have an application pool. Can you guys see that? Let me try it this way. I have a terminal session over to the other box here. Apologize for not having a VMware session, but I had a whole 6 days to get ready for this. And what we have here is application pools. I don't know if you can see this much better than the others than that slide was, but I have 3 pools here. okay? And just for sake of example, I also have 3 websites, and what I did is I just associated each website with a particular pool. Okay, so here are your application pools that you can associate, 1 or more websites. I could have associated all those sites to one pool if I wanted to. I mean, you have the greatest degree of flexibility as you want, but the pools themselves if I look at the identity tab here, again, by default, this is the default setting. I haven't changed anything on the box. It's predefined running as the network service account. Okay? I can also, again, what's the difference between the network service and the other ones available to you? I could say local service, but local service assumes that box doesn't have to talk to any other boxes. Okay? If this box needs to communicate with another box, you want to use the network service. They both have the same amount of privileges on that box. Okay? But the network service has the ability to talk to another box, where local service does not. And local system is there. You can choose to do that. I highly discourage you from doing that, okay? Because you're not really getting the benefits of the security model built there. And if you need something to look more along the lines of IIS 5, okay, for backward compatibility or whatever, you can run it in, say, the IWAM context, okay? Which is what your medium and your isolated applications in IIS 5 run in. Okay? So that's what that slide there is trying to show. And that's what I just showed you, how you configure the actual process or the identity the process runs under. The recycling, there's 4, the tabs that are across that dialog box that I just had up there. You have recycling, you have performance, you have health, and you have identity. I'm going to run through them all. I already did the identity, so I don't have to. But recycling, you can choose to recycle on a number of different parameters. You can just recycle every X amount of minutes if you want. Why would you do that? Who knows? Okay? Huh? Bad code, right? It's not a bad idea, really. Just say, once a day I'm going to recycle the app. Because when you're recycling it, you're not killing the box. I'll show you what I mean by recycle. Okay, recycle isn't killing the app. Okay, it's just starting it over again. Okay, you have a copy that it'll basically make a copy of, right? And any requests that we're going to that are held for a second. And when this one's spun up, it'll just route those requests that way. You can recycle it based on number of requests. Again, this is a reliability feature, but it kind of goes along the ways of a DOS. It's not saying it won't DOS your box, but it may make the DOS a little less severe if you can tune those number of requests just right. And again, you could say at certain times recycle the worker processes. You can set it by memory, by virtual memory, and by maximum used memory. Again, this would all be specific fine-tuning that you wouldn't just set on a whim. You'd have to actually go through and stress test it and see what you're looking at. But the ability to do this is, light years above what you had in IIS 5. Okay? Should make the box a lot more reliable. And also, if anyone's ever done any real, attacking on a box, how reliable is, if opening up a netcat shell on a web server, how reliable is that really? Okay? Even if you say, listen really hard with the capital L so you can come back and do another connection, chances are, if you try and reconnect too many times, you're going to crash that process. Right? So, recycling it, if anyone did have something nasty running on your box, you make it go away. Doesn't mean it won't come back, right? But at least you're getting rid of them temporarily. Okay, here's the overlapping recycle. You had the old worker process. You decided it's 12 o'clock, I'm going to recycle it. So it fires up a copy, okay, through the web admin service. It starts up the new one. The request comes in. still going to the old worker process. Eventually, the new worker process will send a signal that is ready, shut down the old one, and then the new requests should be routed to the new worker process. Okay? So that's what the recycling does. When you had to recycle INET info, what was it? It was an all or nothing event. Right? IIS reset, everything's down until it comes back up. All right? So this is the better alternative to IIS reset. Another way to counter DOS from a programmatic perspective. With an ISAPI interaction, you can do the report on healthy, and this is where I was talking about the if the script doesn't time out, if it doesn't catch the timeout when a particular script is hung, and it'll just stay in a hung state, you have the ability to do a report on healthy to allow an ISAPI to report to IIS that it needs to be recycled. Now again, this is something that has to be there in your code, but at least it's there. Okay? That ability is there. Highly recommend if you write code and you write ISAPIs that you investigate using that function. So if your extension or filter gets caught in a hung state, it can report back, recycle me. Okay? Health detection, the other tab on there that we haven't looked yet. When a failure occurs, it publishes an event to the event log. It will check the crash count that you set. Okay? By default, you have 5 and 5. 5 crashes within 5 minutes. If that's too liberal for you, you can tweak it down. All right? If the crash count is greater than the max allowed in that time, disable that app pool and start a new process. Okay? So it all comes down to that recycling of the process that we looked at before. You have a rapid fail protection. Allow only, that's what I just said. I have a bad habit of doing that. I'll talk about what I'm doing before I actually show it. So if you start seeing 503s coming back, service unavailable, that means a forced recycling occurred, not that graceful recycling that we saw. So something really crashed hard, and boom, you had to get that app pull back up quickly. Yes, sir.
Have the WAS service running all the time, or does it need to be running when you want to administer?
That's a good question. The question is, does the WAS service have to be running all the time? Yes, it does. It sits there and watches what's going on. So it does have to be watching what's going on. I mean, technically speaking, it doesn't, and the queue would just fill up, but nothing would ever get responded to. I mean, if you want it to be a functional application, then yes, it does. Okay, I'm going to move on from just basic IIS 6 stuff and talk a little bit more about ASP.NET. Are there any specific questions on the IIS 6 piece? Yes, sir.
Are there event log entries associated with all of that crash detection and now restarting?
Very, very good question. Do those types of events show up in the event log? Absolutely. Okay, the recycling, the crashed events, all of that. The event model in IIS 6 is much greater than what it was in IIS 5. In fact, all the eventing in 2003 is much more robust than it was with 2000. Okay, so we'll look at the security layers of ASP.NET, configuring ASP security, and we'll talk a little bit about server-side input validation. Now, ASP.NET is a huge topic. I'm only going to touch on the key parts of it. You could spend half a day on just ASP.NET. But the layers are, it has to go through IIS first. Okay, and I'm only talking about ASP.NET as far as IIS 6 is concerned. Because remember, ASP.NET can run on IIS 5, but I'm not talking about IIS 5. And there are differences. All right, there are differences. But for our context, IIS does its security layers of what type of authentication, if any. There's a tool called URL scan. How many people have actually used URL scan? Good tool? Very good tool. I'm going to show you some stuff with URL scan here shortly. And URL scan is not specific to ASP.NET. I'm not trying to say that URL scan is part of the ASP and only the ASP security layer. URL scan is for any web stuff, for lack of a better term. In fact, you can take URL scan and run it on ISA server, which is our reverse proxy for web services. Okay? In fact, it's a very effective way of doing it. So you block everything out at the proxy before it even hits your web server. File ACLs. Obviously, any files that are part of your web app should be ACLed to only give access to exactly what's needed. So when I'm talking about static file ACLs, I'm talking about NT permissions there. Then ASP.NET web service extensions, we're going to look at, well, I got URL scan, and I can do this with URL scan, and then I got these things called web extensions. When do I use what? And we'll talk about when you may want to use one over the other. You have the capability of doing authorization by both role and URL with ASP.NET. Okay, the roles thing can be either Windows domain accounts or something called forms authentication, where you either pull the info out of a database or you create your own little config file with users stored in there. Okay, but there's a great degree of flexibility with how you map a role. And actually, the URL, you can actually say, you know, this particular file here, if it's in my URL, I'm only going to allow this role access to it, and I'm only going to allow the get verb to touch it. So I can do all that with ASP.NET. And I already talked about the mapped extensions to ASP, which I'll show you in just a minute. So when you enable ASP.NET, you have a new account called ASP.NET and a new group called IIS_WPG. As always, you can reconfigure all this stuff in IIS Service Manager. For multiple pools, and the reason I'm talking about this, I'm trying to get, if you need complete isolation, say you're a web hosting company, right? And you have two competitors actually on one box. And you have their website sitting right next to each other. They have to be completely isolated, right? The heck with their competitors, right? You just want a reliable box. Okay? So here's what I would recommend. Create some low privilege accounts for each pool. Okay, remember, you want to put one website in one pool, another website in the other pool. Add those accounts to that IIS_WPG group because they've already been automatically ACLed to the files they need to get access to or don't need access to. For instance, anyone in that group is not going to touch your EXEs. Okay? They're not going to touch your System32. They're not going to touch your repair directory. Okay? And then configure each pool with the appropriate identity. So yeah, they run by a network service by default, but maybe you want to configure your own identity for that pool to run under, and then you want to configure another identity for that pool to run under. Then you have complete isolation all the way through. Okay? Your ASP.NET and iUser accounts need read and execute NTF permissions to any of your ASP.NET files, ASP.x, ASMX, etc. And there's a technique in ASP.NET called code behind, where your ASPX and ASMX are basically shells, if you will, that pull in other code that sits behind the scenes. So no one from the web server is actually directly hitting that code. But since I don't know of any specific way to take advantage of that, but that's not saying that tomorrow someone might figure out a way to take advantage of that, right? I think it's just a matter of time before we'll see some types of vulnerabilities in the ASP.NET space, right? I mean, or at least we have to assume, we have to take that default position. So if you're using code behind, make sure you ACL those files appropriately as well, right? Don't put everyone full control on them, is what I'm trying to say. Because you have to create those files, so it's up to you to ACL them. The config files. Has anyone gone through an ASP.NET config? The machine config and the web config and all that? A lot of stuff in there, right? It can get tedious, but you have a high degree of control as well. It's a hierarchical thing. What are the config files? They're XML files with web and application settings. ACL these files tightly. By default, the users and power users on there, I would remove them. That's just me, okay? There's no reason for them to be in there. Only give them exactly what you need. The hierarchy that it goes is machine.config is the top of the tree. Then you have web.config for everything ASP.NET. Then if I have application X, that is another app, right? That will have its own web.config. And the configuration trickles down. So if you set you have settings in machine.config and then web.config and then the individual web.config, your settings for that app are the resultant of all those three. Yes, sir. The question is, what else does machine.config influence? A lot. Machine.config has a lot to do with .NET, the .NET framework in general. There's a lot in there, absolutely. But it's kind of beyond the scope of what we're doing here. But there's a lot in there, absolutely. Yeah, be careful what you do in machine.config. Good point to bring up. Try and stay in the web.config files to do what you need. I had that in there for point of clarity so you know that does definitely impact what you're doing. It will affect what you're doing down at your application level. Okay. Something I've seen many times, and I cringe every time I see it, don't put connection strings in your config files, right? Because basically that's a clear text file. Don't put usernames and passwords in there. All right. If anyone wants to know the ways to get around that, you can store a lot of that stuff in the registry. Mike Howard, the book, Writing Secure Code, has a lot of examples on how to do that. If you want to know all the details about keeping that stuff out of the config files and still getting access to it securely. Yes, ma'am.
So I thought best .NET Core best practices for copy installs. So if you start doing stuff in the registry,
The question is, the idea of ASP.NET was to do Xcopy installs. Well, that gives you a great degree of flexibility, but speaking strictly from a security perspective, I don't. Any username and password in clear text in me is just taboo. I mean, I just wouldn't do it. I understand putting it in a registry. You're making a little more work for yourself for configuration-wise, but there's ways around that too. I mean, if the goal is to keep things secure, then you want to build as many layers in there as you can. Okay, a little example of users and roles in your web.config file and your system.web tag. For authorization, I'm going to say for this application, I'm only going to allow the users Sue and Joe, and I'm going to deny all other users. The question mark in your config files is any unauthenticated user. So the only two people that can get to this app are Sue and Joe. Now, Sue and Joe, again, can be Windows domain accounts, or they can be forms-based authentication. It's up to you. Continuing on with the authorization, from another perspective, not just the users, but what else can we do in the authorization space? What verbs am I going to allow on this particular web app? Okay, I'm only going to allow the head, get, and post, or whatever suits your needs. All right. I'm only going to allow the role of administrators and the role of users, and I'm going to deny everybody else. And again, this might not be I didn't take this from an actual app I did. This is really for illustrative purposes, so you can see what you can do in here. Okay? You can do the actual HTTP verbs. And actually, you can go down a little bit more granular than this. I'll show you in just a second. And you can assign the users in your config files as well. You can go to the location tab. I mentioned you can actually go to a specific file. In this case, list users.aspx, and say for that particular file, this is an example of an authentication mode being forms. It could be a Windows domain account. It's completely up to you. And the authorization for that is the admin only, and I'm going to deny everybody else. The star, as you would imagine, is everything. So for that particular file, I'm only going to allow the admin account to touch it. Okay? Again, I could have done HTTP verbs here. I could get very granular with this. If you want some real details on how to configure these files on the TechNet site, you go to TechNet and just do a search on ASP.NET Security. There's been 2 recent guides put out that are very, very good on telling you how to configure these config files for what you need. I apologize, I don't have the URL here for you. Okay, I said I'd tell you real quick about on server-side validation. How am I doing on time? I got 15 minutes? Okay, I gotta hurry. Server-side validation. You gotta validate the input at the client with JavaScript or whatever script you like, and you gotta input or validate the input that's hitting your server. Okay? Just doing it at the client isn't good enough. You also have to do it at the server because who knows where it really came from at the server, right? This is just a very plain example of how you can do this, but you can expand from this and plug in what you need. Basically what this is a control that's a C# example that's going to validate input coming into it, and it's only going to accept an ID that is numerical and 4 digits only. Okay, and there's a regular expression there. Server validation, try, you're going to create a new regular expression. And if it doesn't match the arguments coming into it, can it? Obviously I snipped it because there's a lot of code underneath that, but that's the nuts and bolts of the code right there. And then on the other side of that is how do you hook into that? Okay. On your form, I'm going to create a text box. I'm going to call it custom validator. It's going to be a server validation and ASP button ID on click, validate button on click, and run at server. So when I put that input out there and I click it, it's going to forward that info, run it at the server, and validate the input there. You should also, what I haven't showed, is client-side code to validate the same information, but you should also have that too. Okay? Cannot have enough layers. Again, if you go to that, if you go on TechNet and look in the ASP.NET Security I told you about, there's scads of examples on the different types of ASP.NET validators. Some really good stuff there. Hopefully this was enough to show you the concept of what you can do so that you can, the thing with code is you can write code to do whatever you want, right? But this is just a specific example of numbers only. If you're doing your own authentication scheme, right, you can do a regular expression to accept users either of a certain type and password of a certain type. The rule of thumb on anything is what? Look for what you are looking for and reject everything else. Don't try and build strings and match for strings you want to reject, right? Only accept what you want and can everything else. Right? Don't look for bad stuff. It's a waste of time. Look for what you know is good and everything else is bad. Okay, what I'm going to do is throw a couple scans at this IIS box so you can see what kind of information we get back. I'm going to show you a tool called the log parser, which is going to be a resource kit tool that comes with IIS 6. A very powerful tool to allow you to write scripts. It's exposed via COM. You can run a command line. You can do SQL-like queries right from a command line if you're looking for specific things in your IIS logs. It's not just your IIS logs. It's the IIS logs. It's your event logs. It's your URL scan logs if you have URL scan. It's WMI events. It's all kinds of stuff that you can look for. And IIS Lockdown I really can't show you IIS lockdown because a lot of the functionality in IIS lockdown was just baked into the product. Okay? But what I can show you is URL scan. I'm not saying you can't use your IIS lockdown, but I'm going to specifically show you URL scan, which is a part of IIS lockdown. And then we'll talk about web extensions and which one makes sense. Okay. Can we all see that? Hopefully? No? That better? All right. What I have two boxes up here. This is an IIS 6 server. It's running RC2 code. I'm just going to run a tool called Nicto against it, which is basically a very similar to the Whisker Perl scanner. And it's got a whole library of known vulns packaged into it. So I'm going to run that and see what we get out here. I'm dumping it out to a log file. I'll open up the log file and we'll take a look at it. And keep in mind, though, this box is just an IIS 6 box that I installed as a default, and then I turned on ASP. That's all I've done. Okay. There we go. Okay, so it ran the scan. I don't know why it didn't run the first time. It finds it as an IIS 6 box. Little custom header in there, X-powered by ASP.NET. One thing you should notice right off the bat is trace and track are turned off. Okay, and this kind of significant because there's a big deal going on right now about trace, right? The cross-site tracing vulnerability, being able to pull back client's information and combine that with cross-site scripting, and you can pull cookies down from a client and get their username and password. So trace is turned on by default. Track, which is similar to trace, is turned off. And we just go through this whole thing, and I'll just scroll down to the bottom because that'll give you the results. But just about every known vulnerability, and obviously not all these are IIS specific, but basically any known vulnerability that we can think of at this time is not there right now. Okay? Again, I'm not saying there's not going to be a new one come tomorrow, all right? But as of right now, it's in a very, very good state. The other thing I want to show you is URL scan. If you haven't used URL scan before, I'm on the actual web server now. When you install URL scan, you configure it with the URL scan.ini file. And there's just a whole boatload of stuff here that you can configure. Right off the bat, you have your allow verbs, get, head, and post. I can do the same thing in ASP.NET, but here's the thing of where to use URL scan, where to use going down to the app level. If you set it on URL scan, you're basically saying, well, on this box here, this applies to everything, right? So it's a bigger hammer. But if that hammer applies to every app that's on your box, then go ahead and do it. So right off the bat, I'm only allowing get, head, and post, and that's all that's going to be allowed in. So if any other verb comes in, it's going to get canned. Headers. What kind of deny headers do we want to put in here? By default, translate, if, lock token. I could put SOAP action in there if I don't want any SOAP traffic coming in. I can put the transfer dash encoding if I want to prevent that box from being hit by any type of chunked encoding vulnerabilities that exist or may come to exist. Now, obviously, if your app requires that, then you don't want to do that. Any header that you don't want whatsoever, you can put there. Okay? So you can actually dig into the HTTP headers and do this. Down the bottom here, there's a new section with the newer version of URL scan, which is URL scan 2.5 with the service pack release, or service roll-up pack, excuse me. You have the ability to, again, dig into the headers, and down the bottom, I haven't commented out right now, but there's 3 of them you can look at. Max allowed content length, so you can actually specify a content length of what size you want to come in. Now, obviously, you need to know your app well, but if you know your app doesn't accept anything in more than 500 bytes and never should, then you set that. Right? Anyone tries to launch a buffer overrun or a DOS against your box, you can block it right there. It never gets processed. Same thing with max URL and max query string. Expect URL scan to evolve. Okay? Expect it to give you the ability to give you even more granular control than that. Right? It's a very powerful tool. As I said, has anyone ever used ISAServer? Okay. As far as protecting web content, and I know there's a talk on IIS 6, but the reason I want to bring it up is I can take URL scan and run it on ISAServer now too. Okay? And say I'm publishing, what we call publishing or reverse proxying 5 websites. All right, I can take that kind of stuff and lock it down on ISA, and it never touches my IIS boxes. So again, another layer of defense. Okay? And I don't think I have much more time, do I? Okay, I'm about out of time, so real quick summary here. Just to summarize, IIS 6 is a brand new architecture. You got your kernel mode listener, you got your web application service, you got your application pools. Security and reliability are the names of the game for it. I tried to give you a real quick overview of what that means to you, how you can take advantage of that when you go to deploy it, and I tried to give you some info on how ASP.NET and IIS 6 kind of work together, and give you some pointers on how to go ahead and lock that stuff down. Remember URL scan, the web service extensions, which I really didn't get a chance to show, so I'll do it real quick right here. If you go to a web app, or website for that matter, and you go into your configuration, here's your extension. I know that's real small, but say on the .asa extension, or any extension you want here, .asp, I only want to allow the certain verb. So you see trace is turned on there, right? So why didn't trace show up? Where did I have it turned off? URL scan, right? So again, your layers of defense there. So in this case, I choose to block that at URL scan, but I could have chose to block it at the extension itself. Whatever works for you is what I'm trying to say. You have flexibility there. And I can go to any extension I want there and configure those verbs. Ones I would definitely take off well, trace isn't going to be there. All right, that's one change from what I have here, which is RC2, and what's going to be RTM. Trace will not be there by default, but debug may be there on a few of them. I would probably take debug off. Okay, and in fact, if you don't need the actual extension at all, then get rid of it, remove it. Okay, just get it out of there. If you don't need it, can it. Okay, and I had to get my one little piece of marketing in there. All right, over 10,000 sites already running, IIS 6. So there's my marketing piece. I'm done. Any questions? Yes, sir. Can I run the what session? The Pro tool, can I run it? Ah. Okay, I'm going to delete this one here first. And we got the same results back. Yeah, I removed it completely. That's a good point. URL scan's gone. Let's make sure it's not on the actual site itself. Aha. That'll do it. It should be different. And now trace is showing up. Okay, and let's see what we got for totals. One item found, which was the trace item. So take URL scan off. Trace does come back. I can turn that off on the verb level if I want. Again, important note on that one is this is an RC2 box. The trace verb on the default install has already been removed between RC2 and what's going to become RTM. So when the actual product hits the streets, trace should be off. Any other questions? I don't know. I really don't know. It's coming soon, but I really don't know. Scott? Any idea? Real soon, yeah. It is coming soon. I mean, the launch is scheduled sometime soon, so it's got to be coming soon. Any other questions? No, like I said, I had about 6 days to get ready for this, so I didn't get a chance to get them in on time to get printed out, but they will be up on the website soon. If you need them, by the way, my email is, let me write it up here real quick. That's MMUCKIN, Muckin at Microsoft.com. If for some reason they don't show up soon, let me know. I'll mail them to you. Any other questions? Thanks for your time.